Welcome to Cooking with Miss Croft. Nailed it or failed it? Today we will be making chocolate chip cookies. Anytime we cook a recipe, we always want to make sure that we have the right recipe in front of us. We have to look very carefully to make sure we don't have something that's close but not quite. For example, we have 4 recipes in front of us. One for beef stroganoff, one for warthog cupcakes, one for chocolate chip cookies, and one for sugar cookies. It's obvious that we do not want the one for beef stroganoff. The other recipes are all for something sweet, but we specifically want cookies, which eliminates the cupcake recipe. That leaves us with a choice between sugar cookies and chocolate chip cookies, and our choice is chocolate chip cookies. So even though the sugar cookie recipe is close, but not quite, we need to remove it and look only at our chocolate chip cookie recipe. When making a recipe, the first thing we do is look at the necessary ingredients. Notice that for this particular recipe, we need 3/4 of a cup of granulated sugar, 3/4 of a cup of packed brown sugar, 1 cup of butter or margarine softened, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1 egg, 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1 package, 12 ounces of semi-sweet chocolate chips. Before us, we see the necessary ingredients for making chocolate chip cookies. We have our baking soda or baking powder, sugars, vanilla, salt, flours, margarine, chocolate chips. But wait, I don't see any eggs. We've just discovered we're missing eggs, so follow me. We've got some work to do. Howdy, neighbor.
How you doing?
I was making chocolate chip cookies and I forgot the eggs. May I borrow a couple of eggs?
Certainly.
Thank you. After we've checked to make sure that we have all the necessary ingredients, now eggs included, we need to read the directions so we will know how to proceed to make these chocolate chip cookies. In this recipe, initially we are to heat the oven to 375 so that it will be ready when our cookie dough is ready. And our oven is set. Next, the recipe asks us to mix sugars, butter, vanilla, and egg in a large bowl. Let's start with the sugar. Notice before me I have 3 types of sugar available: powdered sugar, granulated sugar, and brown sugar. I can nail it or fail it. In this bowl, I'm going to show you what happens when we don't follow the recipe precisely. This will be our nailed it batch. The first ingredient we are to add to each recipe is granulated sugar. But let's say I wasn't being very careful about my choices, and I chose sugar, but it wasn't the granulated kind. So, in my failed it batch, I'm going to, instead of doing 3/4 of a cup of granulated sugar, I'm going to use powdered sugar. I have a choice. I can measure a little less than a 1 cup, or I can use the 1/4 cup 3 times. In my nailed it batch, I'm going to do the same, but instead of using the confectioner's sugar or the powdered sugar, I'm going to use the granulated sugar. Notice I filled the 1 cup almost full, but leaving about 1/4 unfilled. The next ingredient in our recipe is brown sugar. Again, the recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup. It specifies, however, that this needs to be packed brown sugar. So, I don't measure it loose. I pack it down so that I have 3/4 of a cup, packed brown sugar. Notice that when I pour it into my recipe bowl, it looks a little bit like a sandcastle. Now let's say that in the failed it batch, I decided to use my brown sugar loosened and not packed as the recipe calls for. Using the right ingredient, but in the wrong amount. The next ingredient is butter or margarine softened. Notice I have two products in front of me. One, which is vegetable oil shortening, that looks a lot like butter, has a creamy consistency, but it's not butter or margarine. Then I have margarine. So in my failed it cup, I'm going to put something that looks very much like butter and has the consistency of butter, just not the color. Its ingredients also are not made of butter. The recipe calls for a full cup, so I will fill this to the top. And then put it in my recipe. My recipe also calls for 1 cup butter. So I'm actually going to fill this half cup twice to make 1 cup, particularly since our 1 cup has shortening in it. And again, it's time to add the next ingredient to the recipe. I added a half cup, but in order to satisfy the requirements of the recipe, I need to add another half cup. The next ingredient we add is vanilla, which gives a delicious flavor to our cookies. The recipe calls for a teaspoon. Now there is a difference between a teaspoon and a tablespoon. A tablespoon is a much larger quantity than a teaspoon. In my failed it batch, I'm not going to pay attention, and I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of vanilla. For my nailed it batch, I'm going to follow the recipe precisely and add only 1 teaspoon. Eggs come next. If I'm not being careful, instead of breaking this egg like I should, I might just drop the whole thing in my failed it. But if I'm being a smart baker, I'm going to crack this egg before I add it. Now it's time to stir. So, guess which batch this is, the nailed it or failed it? It's the failed it because we've not taken the time to break our egg beforehand, but we're going to break it now. And we will mix all of our ingredients together. I had already mixed the other ingredients for our nailed it batch together, and you can see the difference. The next ingredient on our list is flour, and we have 2 choices: all-purpose flour, or we have flour used to make flour tortillas. The recipe specifically calls for all-purpose flour, so that's what we will measure. We need 2 cups and 1/4 of a cup for the recipe. I'm going to start with my nailed it batch and measure 2 1/4 cups. There's 1 cup. 2 cups. And a 1/4 cup more, I could just measure 1/4 of the way up this cup measurement. In my failed it batch, I'm also going to add flour. But this time I'm going to add the flour used to make corn or flour tortillas rather, and I'm not even going to measure it. I'm going to look for something that looks close to how much I used for the other one, but maybe not quite. Notice that this flour has a different texture than the flour for the nailed it batch. But at this point, they look very close. Again, it's time to mix. Now down to our final 2 ingredients, baking soda and salt. We'll begin with the salt. The recipe itself calls for a 1/2 teaspoon. I am going to use the correct ingredient in both. However, in my failed it batch, I'm not going to be careful about my measurements. Finally, we're down to the baking soda. Notice that I have 2 choices in front of me, baking soda and baking powder. Each reacts differently with the other ingredients in the cookies to get the desired outcome. So let's look at the baking soda. The recipe calls for 1 teaspoon. So, 1 teaspoon. But in my other recipe, I didn't look carefully. I just saw baking and it looked powdery, so I'm going to use the baking powder in this recipe. Again, close, but not quite. Once we mix all of these ingredients, we'll then add the chocolate chips. We're almost there. We're down to our last ingredient. And we save the best for last, the chocolate chips. I was smart enough to open the bag ahead of time so that you wouldn't see chocolate chips fly all over the place when I tried to open them in front of you. Into each recipe goes a 12-ounce bag of chocolate chips. We'll stir these and then spoon them onto a cookie sheet to bake. Once they've baked, you will see the final result. Keep in mind that the purpose of this demonstration is to show you that formulas work in much the same way recipes do. We need the right ingredients. We need the recipe that fits what our desired outcome is. We need to measure carefully, use the right ingredients so that it all comes together with our desired area, volume, surface area, whatever it is we're trying to find.